We are actually going to start early. So we'll get a couple of the housekeeping things out of the way before we start. And just as a reminder, this will be recorded today. And if you're part of the Zoom audience, the chat feature will be locked until the Q&A session at the end of the lecture. So I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. I am Tim Flacco. I am currently the president of Phi Kappa Phi, provost for Tri-College University, and director of operations for NDSU downtown. NDSU is a proud partner with the NDSU chapter of Phi Kappa Phi to offer the annual NDSU Phi Kappa Phi Lectureship Award to share in Phi Kappa Phi's mission, which is to recognize and promote academic excellence in all fields of higher education and to engage the community of scholars in service to others. The Phi Kappa Phi Lectureship was created by President Brashani in 2015 to showcase NDSU faculty talents that exemplify Phi Kappa Phi's mission and motto, let the love of learning rule humankind. Phi Kappa Phi is not a fraternity or a sorority, but an honor society. Our NDSU chapter is 110 years old, dating back to 1913. It's the nation's 10th oldest chapter out of more than 300 throughout the country, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. NDSU's chapter is the only one to have that honor in North Dakota. Emphasis added. Rivalry never dies. The NDSU Phi Kappa Phi faculty lectureship shall be awarded to those individuals who are outstanding high-impact research, scholarship, or creative activity consistently supports NDSU's top-tier research status and who have a proven ability to effectively present their research to a broad community of land-grant tradition. More specifically, all winners of the NDSU Phi Kappa Phi faculty lectureship must, 1, have a proven ability to effectively and dynamically communicate their research to an intelligent listener, and 2, be passionate about communicating what they do to others so that the latter can appreciate the beauty of the research and how its ramifications impacts others. It is my honor to represent a friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Lardy, who is the Vice President of Agriculture Affairs at NDSU, a native of Sentinel Butte, North Dakota, a Phi Kappa Phi member, and for a very long time he was, and a darn good horse rider in his day. Dr. Lardy.
Thank you, Dr. Flacco. As Tim said, I have the privilege of serving as Vice President for Agricultural Affairs, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker. So Dr. Sam Markell is a professor of plant pathology and an extension specialist at NDSU. I've admired his work for many years. His work focuses on prevention and management of diseases that threaten legume and oilseed crops grown in North Dakota. Sam's pathogen surveillance and disease management efforts have prevented the loss of millions of dollars to U.S. farmers, helping secure both family farms and the food supply. His research program addresses the immediate needs of North Dakotans, and his extension work emphasizes the delivery of those results to farmers and agricultural professionals that support them. Markell has published approximately 75 research papers in a variety of academic journals, 100 popular press articles, 150 extension publications, and over 350 extension circulars. In addition, he has delivered over 300 media interviews and 600 presentations to farmers and community members. Sam believes that challenges, both big and small, are most effectively addressed when informed partners pursue common goals. The impact of Markell's led Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition is an example of how a partnership between the largest land-grant universities and agricultural companies was needed to address a $1 billion problem in a parasite that attacks U.S. soybeans. Markell's honors include academic, educator, and communicator awards from NDSU, the American Phytopathological Society, the Mid-America Crop Life Association, the National Agri-Marketing Association, and the Public Relations Society of America. Dr. Markell's lecture this afternoon is entitled Pathogens, Plants, and Partnerships. Please help me welcome Dr. Markell.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. Hear me okay? Yeah? Well, I really appreciate you spending the afternoon with me. I really appreciate you spending the afternoon with me. Thank you, Dr. Lardy, for the introduction, and Tim for all your work do with Phi Kappa Phi. So I'd like to thank first the awards committee. Tom, Elizabeth, thank you for doing that. The opportunity is great. I really thank you for this. I also want to acknowledge before I start the Department of Plant Pathology and all the people that do the really hard work that make us look good, the graduate students, research specialists, postdocs. Thank you all for that. I also want to acknowledge my family. 3 of the 4 are here, my wife Veronica and twin daughters who are seniors in high school, Isabel and Sophia. And happy to say that in the fall, they're going to be NDSU incoming freshmen. So, and as much as I think that I'm a good recruiter and a good person to put the NDSU pride on, it was actually Corey Shack, the admissions counselor. So I don't know if he's around or not, but I really appreciate it. And lastly, thank you to the audience. I appreciate everyone here and appreciate everyone on Zoom. And I hope that you enjoy this afternoon's lecture. So as a matter of outline, I'm going to talk about pathogens, plants, and partnerships, but I'm going to take you through a journey of time. So we're going to start in the 1840s in Ireland, where the birth of our discipline happened. And really the mission was established of what we do and still exists today. We're going to move into the early 1900s and talk about plant pathology, really how it started at NDSU and how that scholarship of research was translated to the growers that needed it the most, as North Dakota was a relatively young state. And then I'll conclude with some of my work. So, but before I get into that, there's a fairly simple principle that I need to introduce to everyone, and the graduate students could teach this maybe better than I could. But the concept is a triangle called the disease triangle. So plant pathologists look at disease in terms of this triangle, where the area of the triangle, that area is the likelihood of disease, the severity of the disease, the epidemic potential, whatever that is. So the area of the triangle, as it gets bigger, the more disease is likely to happen. And the size of that is controlled by 3 things. The first corner is a susceptible host, right? So you need a host to have disease. You have to have a plant. And maybe that's a tree, maybe that's turf grass, a soybean plant, whatever that is. But it needs to be susceptible to the pathogen around. Okay, so if it's resistant, that doesn't matter. So the next corner is the pathogen itself. The pathogen needs to be there to cause disease. Obvious, right? I mean, that's really obvious. But it has to be virulent. And pathogens have lots of different levels of virulence and aggressiveness and other things. The third is a conducive environment. So you can have a plant and you can have a pathogen, but if you don't have an environment that's favorable, maybe it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, whatever it is, you're not going to have much disease. If you can take one of those out, the area of the triangle will collapse and you'll have less disease. So I'm going to refer back to this afternoon, but this is the concept that most of us are taught right away, even as undergrads, right? Okay, so the story really begins in a different world. It's our world, but in the 1840s, it might as well be a different world. Communication was different, transportation was different, cultures were different, the world was expanding, there was massive colonies everywhere from a few select countries in the world. And our story is going to focus on this little area here in Northern Europe. This is Ireland and England. Ireland in green, England in pink. Now they're really close. They're only 50 to 100 miles apart, depending on where you are. But just keep in mind, there's no phones. This predates all the communications that we have now. And agriculture was very, very different. So a great famine would happen here. But to explain how that occurred, I can't just talk about plant pathology. It has to see the social context and economics a little bit. So we're going to start with that. So in England, around 1840 or so, England was the wealthiest nation in the world, by far. And they were pushing the Industrial Revolution. The things that we take for granted now, many of those started in England at that time. Part of the reason they were able to do this was this massive empire that they had. So this is late 1800s, so the time frame is not quite right, but anything you see on this map in pink is part of the English Empire. It's just massive. And I would argue that the most important colony was Ireland, and simply for the fact that it's so close. So if you have a colony that's only 50 to 100 miles away, you can bring in perishable food. You can bring a feeding population moving that quickly, as opposed to, say, Australia, which at the time probably is going to take you a couple months. Okay, so those two are intertwined. Ireland, on the other hand, was almost completely the opposite. They underwent a massive population boom, especially for this time in history, of almost 4 times the population in a century. It resulted in a bunch of deindustrialization as well. So while England is pushing the Industrial Revolution, things are collapsing in Ireland. If you can make linens and things cheaper using the Industrial Revolution techniques, the hand linens are not as needed, right? And that collapsed across all of Ireland. As a result of the population boom and the collapse of the industries, there was about 2.5 million landless laborers in Ireland at the time. And as a general rule, the whole population was desperately poor. Now, the result of those two systems came together in something called the Conacher system, which roughly translates into garden. So this would be a totally different agricultural system than we know today. And basically how it would work is you'd have a landlord in England. Remember, Ireland's a colony, right? You'd have a landlord in England who owned the land in Ireland. They didn't live with them, they were over there. They would employ somebody, a group, a person, whatever that is, to manage the land in Ireland. That person or group then would rent it out to the Irish, especially the landless laborers. And they would rent it out in maybe 5 to 10 acre little pieces. Now, the Irish then would grow the crops to pay for the rent on the majority of the land. So for example, if you have 10 acres, the Irish then would grow on maybe 8 of those acres, wheat, animals, whatever it was, to pay for the rent that got shipped back to England. They would use the rest of it to grow the crop to feed themselves and their family. So if you only have 2 acres or 1 acre of a crop to grow, you're going to find the most important, high value, nutritious crop you can, and that was the potato. Okay? So at the time, about 60% of the food in Ireland that was consumed was a potato, and maybe 3 to 3.5 million people lived exclusively on that potato, and they could survive on it. It wasn't fun, I'm sure, but they could survive. Okay, so this is the host in our story. So what is the potato? Everyone knows what a potato is, right? Kind of. So potatoes, they did not come from Northern Europe or North America. They came from South America. This is pointing to an area, I think Dr. Secor tells me newer data suggests northern Chile is the origin of potatoes. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. What happened with the potato is it started moving around and eventually it got to Northern Europe. And from there, it was spread across the globe. But something important didn't happen when the potato was moving around. A lot of the pathogens did not come with it. Okay? So the Irish are growing this potato, but they're not just growing any potato, they're growing something called the lumper. Sounds really appetizing, right? The lumper. So across Ireland, this was what they grew. An example of what the lumper was, there's lots of this in the historical record. I'm just going to read you one. The lumper potato, widely cultivated Western and Southern Ireland before and during the Great Famine, was bland, wet, and poorly resistant to the potato blight, but yielded large crops and usually provided adequate calories for peasants and laborers. Remember, this was a desperately poor population. Bland and wet really sounds awful, especially if that's all you eat. But this blight wasn't there at the time. Okay, so what's the environment? The next corner of the triangle. What's the most important thing to do if you go to Ireland? What's the most important thing to pack? Rain jacket, yeah. The Daily Edge had a really interesting article about the 11 levels of Irish rain a few years back. And it goes from kind of nice, pretty rain to not so nice rain to just torrential, terrible rain that doesn't stop. It is wet and cool. It is just wet and cool. That's what it is. Okay, so we didn't have a pathogen. We didn't have an epidemic. We didn't have a famine because the pathogen wasn't there. So that's about to change. The triangle is about to come complete. So this pathogen was later named Phytophthora infestans, which roughly translates into plant destroyer. And this pathogen is really interesting. This isn't a group of pathogens that we commonly call the water molds. And the reason we call them the water molds is because they need water. They've got swimming spores, they swim around. And if you're wet, oh my goodness, that is the environment they love. They love it. Well, this pathogen wasn't from South America or Europe, actually. So while potatoes originated down here somewhere, Phytophthora infestans originated somewhere in Mexico. At least that's the current thinking. Now, until recently, it wasn't really understood the lineage, how it actually got there, what line actually got to Northern Europe, but there were some scientists recently who did some work with botanical samples. This one above me was one of the ones in the study. It's 1847. It was infected with Phytophthora, and they were able to backtrace that to the original place. So in 1845, we in the United States sent late blight to Ireland, the pathogen to Ireland. And when it got there, it showed up first in Belgium. Now, it showed up in the end of June to maybe mid-July, and they saw some disease, and they saw problems, but it started to spread through Northern Europe. And by mid-September to mid-October, it showed up in Ireland. So the crop was already basically made, right? But they're probably seeing some things in the field. My guess is they're seeing things like this. So here you start to see some of the symptoms. You've got lesions on the plant. If you flip it over, you've got some of that white fluffy growth. Remember all those spores swimming around? This is just loaded with it, right? Just loaded with it. There's a problem, right? So the Irish probably weren't too concerned about this, but they would have taken notice. Obviously, they're surviving on that crop. Anybody ever planted potatoes in the garden? You got, oh, you pathologists know. Yeah, what's seed? Seed's the tuber, right? Well, if you rain a lot, and Ireland rains a lot, you'll get those spores moving into the soil, they'll go into the tuber, and then they infect your seed the next year. So in 1845, not a lot really happened. That was about to change very fast. In 1846, the whole crop was infected. And this is a picture that Dr. Secor of Viviana maybe took in a field of late blight. You can go in a week or two from a healthy looking crop to just something that's totally devastated. So imagine, just imagine being in Ireland at the time, right? What are you thinking? This is your food source. Why is this happening? Well, where did life come from in the 1840s? Spontaneous generation, right? Organic substances, right? There's no scientific reason for this at the time. They probably also were thinking, what will we eat? That's what I'd be thinking, right? This is it. And a lot of them would be thinking, are we going to survive this? And the unfortunate answer is a lot of them didn't. This is a letter to Trevelyan, who's the finance minister, sent from a person passing from Cork to Dublin, right across the country. He pens it on August 7th, and he says, on the 27th of last month, this would be July, I passed from Cork to Dublin, and this doom plant bloomed in all the luxuriance of an abundant harvest. Returning on the 3rd, I beheld with sorrow one wide waste of putrefying vegetation. In many places, the wretched people were seating on their fences, wringing their hands and wailing bitterly at the devastation that had left them foodless. So I'm going to show you some images of what it was like there briefly. They're not pictures. Cameras, as we know it, didn't exist. Newspapers would send illustrators out to the field. So they would draw, right? They draw what they saw. So look at these as if they're photographs. So you can see a family here looking at the devastation that had left them foodless. This was really common. You know, in agriculture, we talk about pounds per acre, tons per acre, whatever. Ireland was probably producing 6 to 8 tons an acre of potatoes. That's probably the range. The estimate is that during the famine in 1846, it was 1/2 of a ton. It was complete devastation. And remember, they would have no seed to plant the next year. You run out of food, and of course, you start digging around looking for anything. So these are children during the famine in 1846. Now, of course, in the system, remember, in the conifer system, there is other food. There's lots of other food, right? It's that other 75% of their acres that are being produced with something else going to England for some other reason to pay rent, right? So there were lots of riots happening. The riots in 1846, there wasn't as many people that died in 46 because of things like this. But this was really kind of brutal, and it took me a while to figure out what was going on here. And if you focus your eyes in the center of the screen, this was the most confusing part to me. So there's a woman holding up a child, right? That's pretty obvious. Well, the answer to these types of pictorial graphs is here. Instead of following us, beggars throw themselves on their knees before us, holding up their dead infants to our sight. This woman is holding up a dead child. If you're cannibalizing the rest of the farm, eating the grain for shipment, well, then you're not paying your rent. And what happens if you don't pay your rent? You get evicted, right? That happens today. Hopefully not to many of us, but that still happens today. So this was fairly common, although it's a little unclear how common. But what would happen would be if you couldn't pay the rent, the homeowners, you see this woman begging to not get evicted, they'd still get evicted. And how they do it is they bring people in to dethatch the roofs, right? So Ireland's tons and tons and tons of stones everywhere, stones houses. Thatch is a premium. If you don't have thatch, you're just living between 4 stone walls. And then once evictions happen, especially in entire villages, famine fever set in. And we know now famine fever was a combination of 4 or 5 different human diseases. Imagine it's not cold and wet's not exactly pleasant for the potatoes, but it's definitely not pleasant for humans either. Now, at the end of the day, there's a lot of debate about how many people actually died in this famine. I spent a lot of time with Dr. Thomas Kennedy. He's a history professor at Arkansas when I was a graduate student. And these are probably the 2 most reliable numbers. In that 5-year period, is about 1 million people died. Maybe in some ways just as bad was the emigration. And if you've heard of coffin ships, this is where that term originated and was used. The immigration in Ireland had started prior to the famine. So in the bars here, you can see these periods of time where immigration was happening before the famine started in millions of people. So in that 20-year, 15-year period, about 400,000 people left Ireland. But during the years of the famine and the 5 years that followed, over 2 million people would leave the island. And the immigration did not stop for another century. So that's why I'm here, at least in part, and many of you in this room. So my personal history would collide with my professional future here in Ireland on this little spot. So this is the Belmullet Peninsula. My mom, my brother and I and one of my sisters were really happy to take my mom to this spot. We know that our family survived the famine, at least some of them immigrated the next generation in the 1880s. And this is her in Blacksod Bay looking at the names of the people for her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, their great-great-great-great-grandmother. And we find it. Now, we don't know for sure that this Mary Laval is our great-great-grandmother. There's actually 4 of them on this sheet here, which is, I guess Mary was kind of a common name at the time. But I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the famine. But why is this important scientifically? So this was one of the first events that challenged this notion of spontaneous generation, that life could come from inanimate objects, right? This guy, Anton de Berry, he's a German botanist. He proved that the white fuzzy growth was life. It was life moving life, right? His work predated that of Koch and Pasteur and all the people that you're taught in school about this. His work was first, and it was because of the famine. So he is the father of plant pathology, and this discipline that we're talking about was created because of him at that time. And really, the mission has not changed. The mission is to make sure this doesn't happen again. So only 29 years after he published that work, NDSU, and its former name, was created, right? And one of the first faculty members, one of the first 3, I might add, 3 faculty members was this guy, Henry Luke Bawley. So he worked from 1890 to 1945, 55 years as a professor. Sorry, Dr. Lardy, but I'm not going to be here when I'm 82. A remarkable guy. He was a remarkable guy. So he was the first plant pathologist, although it often says botanist and zoologist, but he was the first plant pathologist at NDSU. And he did a lot of really good plant pathology, but he also brought a couple other things to campus. And I wouldn't be here personally without him, because he was the first football coach at NDSU. And those of you that know me well know that I came to play football and be an engineer, and I played football for 4 years, had a fine career, and I was an engineer for about 4 weeks. My hat's off to engineers, but it wasn't for me. So he had a 500 record, and I knew in the locker room of the name because he was on the walls. And this was the old locker room in Dakota Field. And I didn't know much about him, except that he was intense. And just to give you an example of that intensity is a story recounted from Rodney Hastings, a former state seed commissioner. And he reports, Bali considered it the lowest point in his career when at a game against the University of North Dakota, those rivalries, right? They don't die. The score was tied. It was late in the game. A North Dakota halfback came around the end and broke into the clear. Bali screamed at his team to catch him. When it became clear that no one would, Bali took control of the situation. He ran onto the field himself and demonstrated a perfect coaching example of an open field tackle of the opponent. Now, no offense to people like Matt Enns and Bill Belichick, but I don't think you could catch a running back at any level. This guy was remarkable. He was just remarkable. So the story goes on. Apparently, the officials had a very long conference. And at the end of it, they decided to award the game to UND, and then they stopped it. They awarded the touchdown and stopped the game. There was no more of this. The coach wasn't playing anymore. They nipped it. By the end of Bali's career, he'd done an amazing amount of work. And just a few examples that you see today. So you see these as you're on 18th Avenue. So many of you have seen this, right? So Bali, one of the things that he did is he was able to demonstrate that pathogens were causing different diseases. In this case, flax wilt. At the time, a lot of the growers were just assuming the soil was burned out, it was dead, whatever, didn't have enough fertility. And you can see on the National Historic Register, this one's been around for a long time. There's several of these, you can take a look. He did this in wheat as well. And he's talking about this lost fertility, the soil's burned out. Well, he's an interesting guy. So I go out and talk to farmers a lot, and he did as well. And we have some of these in the department, and I'm just floored by this bottom statement. Eventually, you will be convinced of this. I'm pretty sure if I talked to soybean growers that way, I'd never get invited back. But he was very effective. He had a lot of solutions to problems. Potatoes is one of them, potato scab. This was something that they were dealing with. And his solution's a little scary. You soak the tubers in 2 ounces of mercuric chloride. I don't know if we have any chemists in the room, but we all know mercury is kind of bad, right? But it solved the problem, at least for a while. And then he was the first state seed commissioner, and this building is also on 19th Avenue, or 18th Street. But I'm going to highlight just real quickly one of the things that he did that he had himself said that he was most proud of. This revolves around this disease called stem rust of wheat. Stem rust was probably the most devastating disease in the US at multiple different times in history. And it hits wheat, you might lose 50 to 75% of your yield. It just lodges the plants. It's awful. Now it's really pretty well controlled right now. We will face this again, probably in our lifetime for various reasons. But this work that he did on stem rust changed the way we managed it. He was one of the first that had understood that there was another plant involved called the barberry. If you didn't have the barberry and wheat stem rust could not complete its life cycle. So he understood that, and this barberry was everywhere. This is from Clifford, North Dakota. You can see they've just lined these fences with these pretty barberry plants. They were everywhere. And in 1916, Bali set out the first barberry eradication program in the US. It was in North Dakota. There was lots of different things that came about trying to get people to get rid of the barberry. So these cartoons, the destroyer of the wheat crop, stem rust coming from the barberry plants. Would you let thieves steal your grain? Of course not. So why let stem rust do it? Get rid of the barberry plants. What else was happening in 1916? We had a bit of a war happening, right? So there was propaganda that tied into the war to try to get people to get it out. But maybe the most creative thing that happened and was engaging the kids. So kids in school were taught about barberry. So they're taught about this plant that they need to get rid of. And then they were sent on wild goose chases to go find it. And they did find it. Many found it. And if they found it, Uncle Sam would give them a medal, right? Congratulations. One of the most effective ways this program worked was through an organization called 4-H, which many of you know still exists today, right? I don't know how many are in North Dakota. Leanne, I saw you early. How many kids are in 4-H, I should say? Oh, well, it's very specific. Good job. So about 1% of our population, more or less. That's excellent. So this organization would teach these kids about barberries at things like 4-H camp. So here's a picture of 4-H camp in Indiana, and they're teaching about barberries. Barberries were effectively eradicated in this area, at least for the most part, and it really slowed down the virulence changes of the pathogen. It made a remarkable difference at the time that still exists today. Another thing that happened during that time, and 4-H has a lot to do with this, is that these kids would then teach their parents. Remember, especially in North Dakota, languages spoken at home might be German or Norwegian or whatever, right? So the information, the extension of all that research was brought out through programs like 4-H and kids to the community. And that made a big difference nationally for us. The last thing I'll mention about Bali, and Tim did a great job of introducing Phi Kappa Phi. I'm not going to go through that again, but Bali was a chapter president, and my guess is that he believed in this organization. And so I'm also happy to talk about Bali for that reason. Okay, switching gears a little bit. So come with me another 75 years forward to modern times. There's a new host. This host is called soybeans. And this is where I start. So soybeans are an amazing crop. They're not from here, somewhere in East Asia. They got to the US, at least in the record, if I understand right, there's record of them in 1804, but it's thought that the colonists were growing them as early as the 1760s. Right? They're not from here. Sounds a little bit like the potato famine, doesn't it? They're used for animals, human nutrition, biodiesel. They're one of the leading crops for trying to get us off the petroleum kick in time. Soybeans are amazing. Now, we grow a lot of soybeans in the US. So this is a map from the USDA. The greener the county, the more soybeans are produced. And you can see nationally, this is a huge, huge amount of land where the soybeans are grown. And in North Dakota, we're number 4 in planted acreage. This is very important to us. We grow 5 to 7 million acres every year. And for those of you that don't know exactly what 5 million acres look like, if you went from NDSU to UND, over to Devil's Lake, down back to Jamestown, and back to NDSU, that's about 5 million acres. Okay? And we grow that much or more every year. It's really important for us. There was an estimate a few years back that suggested $1.5 to $2 billion is the value of the North Dakota soybean crop. That's a lot. And that's probably rolled around multiple times beyond this 1.7. And part of the reason that we're so good at it in the US and North Dakota is we've got the perfect environment. We have the perfect environment. Until recently, we also had a lack of pathogens. That's, of course, started to change in the last century. So you know where I'm going with this. There's a pathogen that comes into play. It's not right yet, not in the 1800s, not in the early 1900s, but this pathogen does get here, and it's called soybean cyst nematode. So this is a parasitic worm. So this is a really simplified life cycle. If you follow me with it, you have these cysts, and the cyst is a female worm full of eggs. Maybe 150 or 200 eggs in the field, maybe up to 500. That worm is an animal. So those eggs hatch, they form male and female, they do their thing, they go back and they infest the root, more cysts, and this life cycle turns maybe every 24 to 28 days, depending on the environment. Okay? This is kind of a monster. So when you get it, a soybean root might look like this. This is a picture I took in Cass County just recently. This plant is suffering. Now maybe the plant looks okay above ground, but it's got a parasite on its roots. Now, the parasite is counterproductive if it kills the plant. wants to keep the plant alive so it can continue to reproduce, right? But it'll take 30 to 40% of the yield when it looks like this. It's quite dramatic. Now, SCN is also not from North America. This is a map of distribution globally now, but it was really known pretty well, I think, in China in the 1880s and in Japan in 1916. It was identified, confirmed. Got to the US in 1954. And once it got to the US, it spread dramatically over the next 7 centuries. It went from that one tiny little county in North Carolina to the Boot Heel in Missouri. Now it's up in Manitoba. Pretty much everywhere soybeans is grown, we have soybean cyst nematode. Now, we've done a lot of work trying to figure out where this is in North Dakota. And my hat's off to the NDSU Extension County agents because they've done all the hard work on this. The North Dakota Soybean Council has been a great partner, and they've supported survey work that the extension agents would bring to the growers, help the growers sample, and we would get the data back to map it. So this map is over the last decade. All those little black circles are negatives and the grays are inconclusive, but anything with colors is real. This is dramatic. There's about 6,000 samples in here. And you can see, of course, it's coming right up the valley in the southeast, but we know it's in Canada north of us. We've got little spots out in Ward County. This is an active spreading problem. So what's the deal with soybean cyst? We've got about $1.5 billion lost every year. Let's think about that. Why is that? We've had hundreds of millions of dollars of research into soybean cyst, and we still are taking this loss. And what's worse is that losses are increasing rapidly. They're increasing every year. There's a problem here. You can't have hundreds of millions of dollars of research and have this situation happening. So what happened? Well, if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, the answer is right there. Life finds a way. Life has found a way. We've been using genetic resistance in our soybeans from the same source for decades. The nematode has adapted to it, and it is adapting to it. This is a major issue. But there's another issue too, one that I've been really heavily involved with, and that's that a lot of the growers, the soybean farmers, don't recognize what's happening. And there are other tools out there, and they're not being used to their benefit. So not only is it changing, the research isn't getting to the place it needs to get. So we wanted to get a better handle on this. And in 2015, Syngenta helped fund some market research. I'm very happy about this. This was a $150,000 bill, which is a lot for plant pathologists. Now, several of us from different states designed the research, and this is a national survey, 17 different soybean growing states. And we wanted to figure out, what do the growers know about this? What do they understand about what's changing? Where are they getting that information? What are their sources? And then, are they doing anything about it? And the results were pretty heartbreaking. So the growers reported that the importance of SCN ranked behind many less economically important diseases and pests. Well, that's fine. They don't think it's as important, except that the yield loss caused by soybean cyst is as much as the next 3 to 5 diseases combined. There's not a contest here. This is the 2,000-pound gorilla, and they're not recognizing it. 68% of growers could not identify their source of resistance in a multiple choice test. Multiple choice test. 4 answer possibilities, 68 couldn't identify it. It's not much different than random, right? And only 27% of growers completely agreed with the statement, using the same source of SCN resistance year after year can lead to reduced effectiveness of that resistance. Think about that. So if I was to stand here in front of you and say, how many of you agree with the statement that if you use the same antibiotic for 20 years, it might not work anymore? You'd all agree with that, right? Right? This is a problem. This is a major problem. And I'll be very frank with you, the growers are really sharp. They are really sharp. This is not a problem caused by them. This is a problem caused by us. We're not getting the right message. This is a problem caused by the companies who are giving them totally different messages. There's no unification in this. And as you know, you have tons and tons of ways to get messages out. They're receiving all this different stuff and none of it's coming together. So we wanted to address this And we thought the best way to do it is to take a non-scientific approach, not talk about the science per se anymore, but focus on unifying the message. So for 3 years, we built a coalition. And the way we did it is we identified the needs of the partners. What are the needs of the chemical seed companies, the ag media? What do the universities need to come together and unify this message? And what does success look like for them? So success for me, I know what that looks like. I want my growers to be happy and make money. And I want the legislature to recognize NDSU extension as somebody important, or NDSU in general, right? That's all success for me. But what's the success look like for a Syngenta or BASF or Bayer? It wasn't as clear to me. We had to figure that out. We looked at a lot of different barriers that we saw along the way, and we identified those and tried to address them. But at the end of the day, building and earning trust was the only thing we could really do to build a coalition. And the way we did this was flying all over the place, meeting with as many people as we could. I can tell you from experience, I started back here, maybe here, and now I usually get upgraded to the front. And it's nice, the bigger seats are kind of cool. I'm not sure it's worth the value of all those miles. Oh, what do you think, Dr. Secor? After 3 years, 2.5 years, we had built a coalition who had come together to talk the same message to the same people. And I want you to take a look at the top rows. You've got 9 agrochemical companies, dyed-in-the-wool enemies. Enemies, that's not fair. They don't get along all that well sometimes, right? You've got major checkoff organizations that help bankroll this, but then you've got 24 different universities. And I am really proud to say that NDSU is leading this effort. NDSU is the one that's in charge of this. And we have great partners and a great team, an inner circle of people who are making this happen. But it's not from Cornell. It's not from Ohio State or Michigan State. It's from NDSU. We have a logo and a lockup. We hired a communications firm that's top notch. And I want to emphasize that I could have never been a part of this and done this without support at home. And the North Dakota Soybean Council is a huge supporter of me, of our department, of our university. They help make things in North Dakota help the world. And this is a good example. So the vision was basically to bring research results to the soybean growers to help them actively manage this problem and help them protect our food supply. And the messages weren't complicated. Rotate to non-host crops. Here's how you do it, right? This is what we can do. Resistant varieties are a little bit more complicated. There's multiple pieces to this, but the idea is we created an umbrella approach that everyone could live under. The companies could compete within the umbrella. We could do our thing within the umbrella, but we all went back to the same message platform. And then seed treatments are a new thing. Since roughly 2014, 2015 for nematicides, this is the same thing Bali was working on 100 years ago. It's just that we didn't have these for this nematode until recently. It's an underutilized tool that we want growers to at least consider. We launched in 2018, and we as a coalition launched together with the companies, the ag media, the universities, the grower groups. It was excellent. I'm not going to go through everything we did. I just want to highlight a few of the things that we did to get the messages out. The first was a video series. If there was one good thing about COVID, it was that more people watched these videos. It was fantastic. The way we did this is we went to multiple states. We talked to growers about who they were, how they were managing their SCN problem, what they needed from us, what it looked like. There's 31 of these videos. In a year, over 2 million views had occurred. Remember, there's about 500 to 600 soybean growers in the US. We had about 2 million views. I think more impressive were the press releases we put out. Remember, as a coalition. So we put a press release out, the ag media would multiply that, the companies would multiply that. We have been approaching about 1,000 articles and about 108 million potential impressions in the ag media. So what that is, a potential impression is an opportunity for one person to see one message one time. That's one potential impression, right? There's 500 to 600,000 soybean growers. We have 108 million potential impressions. That's an opportunity for somebody in agriculture to see that our message is about 200 times. They might not know it's coming from us per se, our logo or whatever, but it's the messages of the coalition. Similarly, the national media was very helpful. So this is Tyne Morgan. You can't get much more famous than Tyne in ag media, and we have many partners like this. I'm Pam Smith, others. Of those reporting, we know we've got 316 potential impressions nationally. When you take into account those that don't report, it's probably between 600 and 800 million. So we're getting that message out. Okay, we've done that. But the question is, did it work? So we repeated the market research in 2020, and we're going to do a modified repeat in 2024, just this fall. And we want to know, did we make a change? So rotating the non-host crops is one of the messages we put out. Did they hear us? The message recall of the growers was 76% of the soybean growers heard us. 3/4 of the soybean growers heard that message. They knew what that was. Did they make a change? Well, it went from 71% to 77%. So 6% more, right? It doesn't sound a lot, but you've got 80 million acres of soybeans. Anything 5% or more is statistically significant. How about seed treatments? Did they hear us? Yeah, 2/3 of them heard us. 18% more soybean growers nationally reported that they're using them. It's dramatic. What about rotating resistant varieties? So this is much more complex. 2/3 of them heard us. Those using it increased by 6%. Those rotating increased by 10%. So what does all this mean, right? So, Dr. Ganji did some plant pathology in his talk. He was very good at it. So I'm going to try to do some amateur economics here. So if growers reported in these surveys, they lose 5.1 bushels an acre annually. The value of that in 2020, which is not as high as today, but in 2020, it's about $50, right? And then there's about 50 bushels an acre. And then there's about 80 million acres in the US, okay? More or less. Now our data tells us that 10% more are rotating. And we have good data that shows when you rotate, your levels drop dramatically. Let's pretend that your loss drops to zero, okay? It's not quite that way, but let's just pretend that it goes to zero. And if 10% more are rotating, that's 8 million acres. If all of those are true, the growers saved almost $400 million from this partnership. Now, I'm not going to put my career on 387.6, but I can tell you it's not 1 million, it's not 10 million, it's hundreds of millions. And every year this is happening. Now, at the end of the day, the most important thing to me is that local growers, this is money in their pocket and in our communities. The impact is right here. I'll tell you real quick one little story about this. It's such an unusual situation for me. So we won a silver anvil. Okay, this is like the Oscars from the Public Relations Society of America. So we flew into New York City. There is literally red carpet going into the Edison Ballroom and people holding Manhattans and martinis. And somebody goes up there and they like rip open the envelope and there's the winner. We won. Carnival Cruise Ships in their like management of the pandemic and post-pandemic was the runner-up. So I'm very happy about this. So a couple key players. So I'm in the corner, Greg Tilka at Iowa State, and then Max Swank and Julianne Johnston at the communications firm. We were the four that were represented. So we've talked about pathogens and plants and partnerships. We started in the 1800s. We talked about early North Dakota, early NDSU, the research and how it got out to the growers. And then we've talked a little bit about one project that one person here, or maybe several, have been involved with, and the impact that we could do at NDSU to the greater world. Now, I don't really know 75 more years from now what it looks like, but it's kind of foggy. All of us might not be in the room except maybe the teenagers over there. We'll see, right? But I can guarantee you that the pathogens are going to be more evolved. We're going to need more plants. We might go to 10 billion people on the planet. And the only way we're going to manage that is through partnerships. So there's a lot of people and organizations I'd like to thank. I threw a few names up here for help in the presentation in one specific form or another, but there's a lot of people here that deserve credit for this. And a lot of you in the audience that have helped me with many, many things. If you don't have support at home, these things don't happen. And so thank you very much.
And now he'll, Tom, Yeah, we, or maybe not.
You need a hand?
I will have, you have to use the microphone, just so you know. And, oh, I got one here, just a second. So the first question is, it's a big award. Are you taking your family out to dinner to celebrate?
Yeah, I think we can do that.
Go ahead, questions?
I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any. And there's a lot of plant pathologists in the room so I might have to dodge a few to people that know more.
Sam, what kind of material is the nematicide used for seed treatment?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for coming, Dr. Clanby. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Clanby was my undergraduate advisor and then also on my master's committee. And I haven't seen you for many years, so it's really great that you're here. So the seed treatment nematicides, there's 7 or 8 different types. So some are nematicidal, some are fungicidal, some are biological. There's one that's a parasite. There's a very big range of what those are. And that was one of the things was tricky with the coalition, is because we didn't want to say use a nematicide because there's so many different things. You probably didn't notice it, but there's a word in front of the nematicide management tool that says consider. It's the only one that says consider. Part of it is because it's an investment, you have to pay for it. Part of it's because they're so different.
Excellent talk, Dr. Markell. I really loved your highlighting of the historical parallels. And one thing I wanted to get your perspective on was with the barberry and the 4-H, activating the youth and engaging them in what at the time was a major problem, had dividends. Has the SEN Coalition thought about or has engaged 4-H on any activities like that?
We have discussed that in broad terms, but specifically engaging them, we have not. It would be a good thing to do in the future. You know, I guess I should take that back just a little bit. So we do have a lot of social media stuff that will go out and they'll absorb some of that, but it's not specifically targeted. So I don't know how much, but a specific concerted effort, we have not. But I do still think that would be effective. 4-H is very active, I might add too. They would take it and run with it, is my guess. Leanne can vouch for that, I mean.
I'll ask a question. So Sam, thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. Are there other coalitions like this for other pathogens, crops, so forth across the United States?
Yeah, so the question was, are there other coalitions like this? And there are some groups. I actually just got back 2 weeks ago from North Carolina. There's 9 different groups that the United Soybean Board, so this is the national checkoff group, that they have funded in pieces or parts aiming at specific issues, none for any specific pathogens. But this is the kind of idea of bringing people together is common. What makes this unique is that the private sector and the ag media are almost never engaged in university work. Of those 9 groups, we were the only one. So, and that was one of the reasons I was there, was to talk about how this functioned and why it's successful and what we have to offer some of these other groups. And granted, they have things to offer us as well, but this type of thing is really unique.
Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was great. I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of the land grant system, the capacity funds, the multi-state projects, and the importance of how that got this conversation going and the impact that it's making.
Well, that sounds very administrative, Frank. Well, I mean, the history of the land grant is, I think what many of you know, how more or less how this occurred, right? And I look at what we do in agriculture. I look at the extension piece, you know, getting that information out, the research that maybe is often behind the scenes, but doing excellent work. And of course, teaching our students at the same time. The funds that come I'm not sure exactly where you're going, but the funds that come to support those three arms are absolutely critical. So like the economic example that I just gave you is about $400 million, right? Well, that was done with universities just paying salaries like mine through extension, right? We already had some of the research done in the past. The value of our salaries is not $400 million, at least that I'm aware of in aggregate, right? So it's just more or less, you know, a couple dozen extension people doing it. But the return on investment of our salary in the university infrastructure is probably 100-fold. Is that where you're going with this?
It's part of the capacity funds that the United States is so brilliant investing in the migrant system. This is a consequence of some of the great foundation work that is accomplished with those capacities.
Thank you. I totally missed that. Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I know. I wasn't thinking about that. Thank you. I appreciate that, Frank.
I have a question from online. So could the coalition that you made sorry, did I get this right? Could the coalition that you made could be used as a model for generating coalitions to deal with other diseases?
Yes, and other agricultural issues. And I visited with other groups about this, other grower groups, other universities, and actually companies. And we've been approached multiple times by groups that were interested in this model. So absolutely. And I want to emphasize, it's not just me, you know, I'm maybe one of the figureheads, right? But there's others out there. So there's several of us that have been approached. So absolutely.
Thank you for super presentation, Sam. You mentioned Bali. You also made reference to the other two original faculty members. Are there other lessons that they left that we need to be latching on to today?
So Dr. Buchanan knows more about all of these than I do, but I would look at the three original faculty members as being remarkably dedicated to NDSU. I mean, I don't know how many years in aggregate they worked in their careers, but I think it was 150 years. Is that right? It was just enormous. They made an impact on this university that lasts today. I mean, not only did it kind of set the tone in our department, but you see their names on buildings. And we have like, what is it? Polymers and coatings, right? Was Lad's thing. The reason we have, or the history of it, is that we have a very successful program there because one of the first originally faculty members, that was his thing. Paints, yes? Is that correct? Paints? Yeah. You have to imagine, I sometimes imagine what NDSU would look like if all those three just abandoned ship right away. And it would be a totally different university. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Totally different.
Sam, thanks so much. That's really exciting stuff. I can't help but, are the water mold you identified in my thin sections the same horrible things that?
Yes. Yes, same group.
Well, I'll scowl at them every time I see them. No, anyway, that's really cool. Thanks so much. Question about the resting stages on this horrible, the cysts, and how long ecologically are we talking about these being able to reside in the soil and then be viable 11 years later or whatever?
Yeah, okay, so part of the question was about the cyst itself. So part of the problem is its survivability. So when that female she's mated, and they mate with many males, so the genetic diversity is really high. The female, when she gets old and effectively dies, her body swells up and becomes basically a protective structure that we call the cyst. Now, a bunch of those eggs will come out, maybe 30–40% that first year, and they'll hatch and do their thing the first year. The rest of them can be protected for years and years and years. There's actually evidence from Arkansas that these cysts were in the soil and the eggs were viable for decades, not just one decade, decades. So we have a great problem with it surviving. And then I was told long time ago, don't worry about nematodes in North Dakota, it's too cold. Well, that's proved to be almost the opposite with soybean cyst. I think we have more problems here than we do in a lot of the southern states. I think our climate is part of that. Not the only thing, but part of that.
Of the major crops in North Dakota, Sam, what do you think are some of the future pathogens that may come into the area and become a serious problem? And
Yeah.
you could talk about worldwide too. I was thinking stem rust, for one, but.
Well, I mean, I kind of alluded to one already in this stem rust disease. And so many of the pathogens that I worry about, actually, a lot of them we already have, but I worry about virulence changes that overcome our genetic resistance or overcome our fungicides or other tools. And they flare back up into these monster epidemics that we had years and years ago. So, I mean, there's smarter people in the room that know about stem rust, but there's a new virulence profile, a new race that was originated almost 25 years ago now in Africa, but almost all of our wheat is susceptible to it. And it'll pretty quickly take us back to where we were. So there's lots of that. I don't know, Berlin, is there any specific one that you're thinking of? That's right. Berlin said that we might not know. COVID is a good example. I mean, in 2018, we wouldn't have talked about COVID, this brand new thing that just appeared out of nowhere. That's probably the greatest threat, maybe disease X, if you will. One more.
Thank you Thank you for the presentation. It was great. You mentioned the unifying the message, but you mentioned also that one of the triangle heads was the environment. So the weather could be different from north to south. So do you mean unifying the message or unifying the source for the message?
Yeah, so, okay, so think about this as like an onion with layers, okay? What we wanted to do was unify the main message. These are the main message strategies, right? These are the main things we talk about. But then we wanted to give room for each of the companies, each of the universities, each of the county extension agents to operate within that message. So the main message that you hear is got all these different things that are specifically pointed at a specific area or target audience or whatever that is. So absolutely, it's totally different. So if I'm in Arkansas, I'm going to be saying very different things than I say in North Dakota. But what everyone did is they subscribed to the same general principle. So you didn't have one company saying one thing and another company saying another thing in the broad sense. They could compete in the competitive sphere for clients, customers, whatever, but the general message was the same. They were singing the same song. Maybe some of them were using a little bit different tune, if that makes sense. So, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot of message variation. A lot of what we were trying to do was to drive traffic to the lowest level. The last person the farmer would sign a check to when they bought seed, talk to with advice like a county extension agent. We were trying to drive traffic there.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Markell.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm David Bertolini, NDSU Provost, and I have the honor to conclude the ceremony. President Cook sends his apologies for not being here, but extends his congratulations for being selected. It's an honor to be selected for Phi Kappa Phi lectureship, and it's extremely hard. And I think today you've demonstrated why you were selected. So we're grateful for that. I think the part of land grant, even though we talk about it a lot, I think one thing that struck me in this is it's so it's what you've done is remarkable in the mission, right? The land grant mission is to, help educate everybody, give an opportunity for normal kids to go to a world-class institution, which you've done working with your grad students, but it's also to help the community and the region. And I think what you've done in a remarkably creative idea, which is to bring, science and marketing together, is just stunning. Like it's pretty amazing. So on that, we're very thankful for that. One bit of history you forgot is that, I think the one thing about Bali, the reason he was a professor but became a football coach is because the salary was better. Just saying. So you can put that as a goal.
All right, thanks.
But anyway, on behalf of NDSU, we're proud to present this document to commemorate today, and we're grateful for your expertise in being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What was it? Let's talk toads.
Let's
Let's
talk,
talk
to-
to-
let's talk to, I love it. Thank you,
Uh,
everyone.
And that was a great presentation, and not being in the field, I really appreciate how you made it relevant and understandable. And I mean, that goes to the essence of what the committee selects, and kudos to the committee for selecting really an outstanding presenter today. So that was extraordinary. So just a couple things of housekeeping. We actually are, as an organization, Phi Kappa Phi is trying to give away scholarship money. So if you go to our website, those scholarships are still open for a little while. Don't read what you say as far as deadlines, but the Carolyn Nelson and John Collenbeck scholarship includes $1,500. Matilda B. Thompson scholarships are also there. And then there's National Phi Kappa Phi scholarships that could be up to $15,000. So something worth noting. There is cake and coffee following this at the reception area. And if you're ever wondering which side is the cake and coffee on, always look, where did Dave Buchanan sit? The wise person who always knows which is the closest he can get to the cake. Sorry, Dave and I are long time friends, so I just thought I would, but it's right outside the door, and you're all welcome to join us afterwards. And again, thank you for coming, and thanks for those who joined us online. Big number there too, so appreciate it. And again, congratulations. And we would also like you and your family, as well as Dr. Lardy and Dr. Bertolini, to come up, and we'll take a picture here too. So you'll have to wait a little bit on the cake. So, but again, thank you all for coming, and that's all. Everything's over that way from here on out.